when you take a look at non-US, are you looking at emerging markets, and is this a sort of the China rebound, the China reopening, lifting all boats in that space sort of story?
Yes, I think that's right. I think that we can expect a pretty strong cyclical-led recovery in China, really propelled by Chinese household consumption. And that should really benefit both Northeast export-oriented economies who make electronics, and over down to Southeast Asian economies, which really benefit from Chinese tourism. So I think from an APAC-wide story, I think the cyclical recovery makes sense, which give a boost to this region's equities.
What happens if we get a resurgence of the US dollar? What currency assumptions are you baking into emerging Asia doing very well?
Well, I think when we look at emerging Asia, the key components are not only China's recovery, but also the interest rate policy set by the Fed, and whether we're going to continue to see a bit of softening there. And that should then have an impact on the US dollar. So in our base case assumption, we think that the dollar has already peaked, and that we're going to see a downshift and a possible pause in the Fed's interest rates, which I think is it's a conducive environment for APAC and emerging market assets.
When can we expect the Chinese consumer to make a comeback, especially given that infection rate surging right now is not helping at the moment?
Well, I would expect a more L-shaped recovery for household consumption. We know that Chinese households are sitting on a significant levels of savings amassed during the pandemic. And these savings are expected to be spent down, although I wouldn't expect a very quick, expeditious spending of this money. But we should start to see some of that spending flow perhaps in the second half of this year. We're already starting to see Chinese travelers to places like Thailand and other parts of Asia. And I think that should really start to ramp up perhaps in a quarter or two.
What about the economies dependent on China? What can we expect in their markets? Are we going to see really the optimism and the boost in those exporters across, say, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan?
Well, I think we got to balance, on the one hand, global growth that's decelerating, and the recent export numbers from places like Korea and China have not been very encouraging. And so overall, I'm not sure that China's reopening will completely offset global demand, but it will certainly have a positive component to it. Other economies I think that should benefit are places like Australia that are commodity exporters. I think China's property market should certainly start to improve as sentiment also starts to ameliorate.
Does that mean earnings season upcoming is going to be quite an idiosyncratic story? And where do you see the leadership there? I mean, broadly, do you think that earnings and valuations levels are fair at the moment?
I think earnings across the world may be a little weak for the coming quarter, given that we're still in a very tight financial environment. And so I think earnings in places like Europe and the US could disappoint. Now, in places like China, I think that we'll continue to see disruptions from the COVID reopening. So I don't think earnings will improve in China perhaps until the second or third quarter. So we might be in this low period where earnings may be a little weaker than expected. But I think that we can expect the Fed pause by the middle of next year, and also China's reopening start to really gain steam. So I think that earnings are really a second half story for this year.